dirty glasses. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Senior Vice President here at the Stimson Center, and I direct our Conventional Defense Program. This month marks a really important milestone in the global campaign to end the use of child soldiers. For those not aware, February 12th was the 22nd anniversary of the entry into force of the landmark UN treaty banning the use of child soldiers. The treaty is known as the Optional Protocol on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict, and it really brought about important change, prompting some governments to amend their recruitment and deployment practices, demobilize children from their rank, and to prosecute officials responsible for child soldiers recruitment. Despite this progress, the recruitment of child soldiers remains a pressing global challenge still today. And in 2022 alone, the United Nations verified over 7,600 cases of child soldier recruitment across 25 countries. And this represents an increase of 21% compared to the year before. And this comes as we're seeing daily in the news as children are caught in conflict under increasing threat, with the UN having verified the highest number of grave violations against children in conflict in 2022, including killing and maiming, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denials of humanitarian access, which I think we all know is on the front page of our papers every day. It's very clear that much more needs to be done to live up to the aims of the optional protocol, and as we'll be discussing today, the United States is uniquely positioned to lead this effort. The U.S. has a powerful but often overlooked tool at its disposal for encouraging governments around the world to end the recruitment and use of child soldiers, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act. Now, we'll hear more about this law in a few minutes, but for those who want a sneak peek, the law prohibits governments complicit in the recruitment or use of child soldiers from receiving valuable U.S. arms sales and military assistance, and as a consequence can provide a powerful incentive for governments across the globe to end and prevent these practices, not only within their own security forces, but also among the non-state armed groups that they support. Today's event is really an opportunity to take stock of U.S. efforts to end the recruitment and use of child soldiers worldwide through the implementation of the CSPA, as it's known. We're going to discuss the current state of child soldiers across the globe, examine how the law can and has been used to address this challenge, and identify some opportunities to further refine U.S. child soldier prevention in the years ahead. To kick off today's discussion, I want to share some recorded remarks from Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois, who was the original sponsor of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, who was very kind to share with us his thoughts on the law's origins and its potential as a child soldier prevention tool.
Hi, Senator Dick Durbin here. Thanks to the Stimson Center for inviting me to speak today. It's been 22 years since the United Nations entered into a landmark treaty to ban the use of child soldiers. This protocol sought to protect children from being exploited and corrupted by war. While the UN's protocol set the tone internationally, I believe the United States had to do more to end this abhorrent practice. That's why in 2008, I introduced the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, a bill that bans the U.S. from providing military assistance or arms sales to governments that use children in combat. The message was clear. We do not support the war efforts of nations that use children as pawns. It is inexcusable, and we will not help enable it. I also introduced the Child Soldiers Accountability Act, a bill that makes it illegal to recruit or use child soldiers under U.S. law. Thankfully, both bills were signed into law by the President in 2008, and since then they've helped the United States protect children around the world. But the reality is that from the Congo to Yemen, nations around the world are still using young boys and girls in combat. We've got to do all we can to protect these kids. They don't belong on a battlefield. Thanks for convening this important discussion. It's an honor to be your partner.
Huge thanks to Senator Durbin for not only the video, but his tireless, relentless work on this issue and for sponsoring this original legislation. I'm really pleased that not only did we have Senator Durbin join us by video, but we have all of you in the room, all of you joining online, and two really great experts on this issue. Our two speakers today, Joe Becker and Dan Olstein, both have extensive experience working to prevent child soldier recruitment and use, and I'm really pleased and grateful that they could join us today to share their insights. Joe Becker is the Advocacy Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. As the founding chairperson of the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, Joe helped campaign successfully for an international treaty banning the forced recruitment of children under the age of 18 for their use in armed conflict. She has conducted field investigations on the recruitment and use of child soldiers and detention of children for alleged association with armed groups in countries around the world, addressed the UN Security Council, testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, trained foreign military officers for the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies, and testified as an expert in a Dutch war crimes trial. She's also an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and the award-winning author of 2 books, which I highly recommend, Campaigning for Justice, Human Rights Advocacy and Practice, and Campaigning for Children, Strategies to Advance Children's Rights, which has a chapter about our efforts to stop the use of child soldiers here in the U.S. and internationally. Dan Olstein, to her right, serves as the Senior Advisor for Children in Armed Conflict in the Office of Security and Human Rights within the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. Dan serves as the department's lead on issues relating to children in armed conflict and the implementation of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act. He also coordinates the Bureau's efforts on the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters and Guantanamo Bay detainees. Dan separated from the U.S. Marine Corps in 2009 as a staff sergeant after 8 years of service in the infantry and the Marine Corps Embassy Security Group. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Studies with a minor in Mandarin Chinese from American University, a Juris Doctor degree from George Washington University Law School, and is an active member of the New York State Bar. I'm going to turn the floor over to Joe, who's going to lay the groundwork for today's session by really discussing the current scope and impact of child soldier recruitment and use around the world, as well as some of the origin stories of the CSPA and highlight some of its success stories. I'll then turn to Dan, who will provide an overview of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, discuss its utility as a child soldier prevention tool, and then I will come back at the end to talk about how the CSPA has been implemented and identify some strategies that may exist. We are going to be taking questions from you here in the audience at Stimson headquarters, as well as those of you online. So please start thinking now about some questions that you have as our speakers give their initial remarks. And for those of you online, I'll give you instructions on how to pose your questions after we hear from Joe and Dan. So Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to Rachel and the Stimson Center for convening this event today and for really continuing to shine the spotlight on the recruitment and use of child soldiers globally. I want to start by just setting a little bit of context. I've been working on the issue of child soldiers for Human Rights Watch for over 25 years. When I started working on this issue in the late 1990s, there were an estimated 300,000 child soldiers involved in armed forces and armed groups in nearly 30 countries worldwide. At that time, it was still legal under international law to send a 15-year-old onto the front lines of armed conflict, and it was virtually unheard of for a commander to ever be held accountable or be prosecuted for recruiting or using child soldiers. Thankfully, in the last 25, 30 years, some things have changed. We now have the optional protocol, the treaty that Rachel referenced and that the Senator referred to, that now sets 18 as the minimum age for participation in hostilities or for any kind of recruitment. And 174 countries, including the United States, have now ratified that treaty. We also see that commanders are being held responsible for recruiting children into their ranks. We've seen high-level prosecutions by the International Criminal Court against Thomas Lubanga of the Congo, for example, or even a former head of state, Charles Taylor from Liberia, being sentenced by the Special Court for Sierra Leone for his involvement in child recruitment in Sierra Leone. And we've seen countries changing their practices, changing their legislation. For example, even during its conflict in Colombia, the government there made a decision to raise its voluntary recruitment age to 18 and demobilize all of the children from its armed forces. But as we know, the problem has not been eradicated. And according to the UN today, there are at least 20 countries around the world where child soldiers are still being recruited and used. The data that we have from the UN indicates that currently the highest rates of recruitment are in the DRC, in Syria, and in Somalia. And in many cases, it is armed groups, for example, al-Shabaab in Somalia or Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria that are recruiting. But we also see recruitment happening by government forces in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. And there are other governments as well, and I think Dan might refer to this when he discusses this CSPA, where governments are supporting paramilitary or militia groups that are using child soldiers as part of their ranks. In the last 25 years, I've interviewed a lot of child soldiers in countries around the world that have sort of illustrated the diversity of ways that children enter into the ranks of armed groups or armed forces. So, for example, in Uganda and in Nigeria, I heard from children about how they were abducted from their homes or from their schools by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda or Boko Haram in Nigeria, and basically forced at gunpoint to join. When I was in Iraq a few years ago, I interviewed children who had been recruited by ISIS, and they talked about how ISIS would take over, new territory, including control of their towns, and basically take over the economies, so that there was almost no way to avoid affiliation with ISIS. If you took any kind of job, whether as a driver or even in a restaurant, chances were that you were working for ISIS. In Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, I talked with children who were part of non-state armed groups, who talked about joining forces because of a desire for revenge against government forces that had committed atrocities against their families and their communities. And in Nepal, I talked with children who had joined the Maoists because theater troops had come to their village and talked about fighting for the poor and fighting for women's empowerment. And children thought, yeah, this is something that I want to be part of. So whether it's ideology, revenge, or just simply seeking a meal or a sense of security, safety, there are myriad ways that children are being used in armed groups and armed forces today. But the reality is that no matter how they come into these forces, they are at grave risk. They are at risk of attack, they are at risk of death, of injury, and certainly trauma from exposure to extreme levels of violence. One thing that we've seen in the context of counterterrorism is that some governments have been moving away from sort of a rehabilitation and reintegration framework and really moving towards a punitive framework, prosecuting, detaining children under counterterrorism laws. And unfortunately, this is one area where we're seeing some steps backwards. From our vantage point, the focus should always be on the recruiters, not the children who are being exploited by armed groups and armed forces. So we really want to talk about the U.S.'s role in preventing child recruitment and use around the world. And, obviously the focus of this event is the CSPA, but, there are a couple other things I want to mention. One is that starting in the 1990s, the U.S. was instrumental in providing funding for really essential demobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs in a variety of countries around the world, either through USAID or through Department of Labor. And these programs are really critical to help children reintegrate into society and to help avoid re-recruitment. A second thing that is really important to highlight is the U.S.'s role just as an example. Probably everyone here knows that the U.S. is not a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but by ratifying the optional protocol to the CRC on child soldiers, the U.S. has set an important example. And one thing that's important to note is that before the U.S. ratified this treaty, it not only recruited 17-year-olds into its armed forces on a voluntary basis, but it also deployed them in armed conflict situations. But after ratification, all four branches of the armed forces adopted new policies that prohibited, for the first time, under 18s in the U.S. Armed Services from serving in combat duties. And this is significant. It's the first time that we're aware of where the U.S. military actually changed its practices to comply with new international law. And so the U.S. is setting a good example with its deployment practices under the optional protocol. But then third, we have the CSPA, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act. And Rachel and I have worked on these issues for a long time, and after the U.S. made that decision to ratify the Child Soldiers Protocol, we and other partners from World Vision and from the U.S. Committee for UNICEF and from Amnesty International started talking about what else can the U.S. do to really use its leverage as a political and a military power to encourage other governments to take the same steps that it had to, ratify the optional protocol and to really live up to its standards. And we started looking at the issue of military assistance. We started with research to look at where the U.S. was actually providing military assistance to governments using child soldiers. At the time, we knew of about 10 governments worldwide. This was in the early aughts, where governments were using children directly in their armed forces. And from our research, we found that 9 of those 10 were receiving some form of U.S. military assistance. And we realized that that was a really important point to work on. So we started engaging with members of Congress, Senator Durbin, then Senator Brownback from Kansas, and others, to generate bipartisan support for this idea that U.S. tax dollars should not be supporting military assistance to governments exploiting child soldiers. And so that was really the genesis of the CSPA, which was, as we heard, adopted in 2008. This law is really quite unique. The only precedent that we're aware of is Belgium, that had an earlier law that prohibits arms transfers to governments using child soldiers. And even though we've had this law now for close to over 15 years, there are still not many other countries that have done the same. Dan is going to talk a lot more about how the law actually works, but I want to highlight just a few of its success stories to show how this really can make an impact in other parts of the world. One example is the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the height of Congo's conflict in the 1990s, the UN estimated that as many as 30,000 children were fighting on all sides of the conflict. In 2012, after the CSPA had gone into force and the Congo had been listed for its government's use of child soldiers for a couple of years, the Obama administration announced that it was going to end its training of Congolese battalions under the CSPA because of government recruitment and use of children. At that point, the United Nations had been trying for 7 years to get the government of Congo to sign and adopt an action plan to end their use of child soldiers, and had failed for 7 years. But within 5 days of the Obama administration making its announcement about ending its training for Congolese battalions, the government of Congo signed that plan. And not only that, but they went ahead and implemented it so that the UN has really documented negligible numbers of child soldiers that have been recruited by the government's official armed forces in the last decade. The second example is Rwanda. In 2013, research came out that Rwanda was supporting an armed group that was operating in eastern Congo called the M23. And the M23 was responsible for large-scale atrocities against civilians, including widespread child recruitment. And so, again, under the CSPA, the U.S. Announced that it was going to end its military assistance to Rwanda because of its ties to the M23. There were some other factors that were involved, but only a few weeks later, after Rwanda cut its ties, the M23 actually laid down its arms. And then the third is that the instance of Chad. And the CSPA can be used not only to cut off military assistance, but it's also a diplomatic tool. And in Chad, the government had been listed for its recruitment of child soldiers, but State Department at high levels delivered the message that if Chad didn't take action on this issue, that it was putting itself at risk of losing its military assistance from the U.S. And so, like the example from the Congo, at that point, Chad chose to enter into an action plan with the UN and took some concrete steps to end its recruitment and use of child soldiers. Rachel's going to talk later about some of the missed opportunities that we've seen with this law, but I really wanted to highlight these examples to show the potential and that this really is a powerful tool that the U.S. has at its fingertips. And we'd certainly love to see many more success stories. But I'm going to stop there and look forward to hearing from Dan and Rachel.
Thanks,
Yeah.
please, Dan.
Thank you, Rachel and the Stimson Center for hosting this event, and to Joe and Rachel for being incredible partners over the years in helping implement and strengthen the implementation of the Child Soldier Prevention Act. The United States strongly condemns the unlawful recruitment or use of child soldiers, recognizing this practice is not only a grave violation of human rights, but it's also a threat to global peace and security. We place great importance on ending the practice whenever it occurs and wherever it occurs. By unlawfully recruiting or using child soldiers, governments and government-supported armed groups rob innocent children of their livelihoods and childhoods and may cause them to commit terrible violence, and in some cases against their own loved ones and families and communities. Although I'm sure most of you are familiar with the CSPA, I want to take a minute or two to provide a brief overview of the law for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The CSPA requires the Secretary of State to identify and publish a list of foreign governments that either have government armed forces, police, or other security forces who recruit and use child soldiers, or those governments that provide support to non-state armed groups, such as paramilitaries and civil defense groups that recruit and use child soldiers. Importantly, the law has a fairly expansive definition of who could be considered a child soldier. Obviously, any person under the age of 18 that takes a direct part in hostilities is a child soldier. But the law also captures incidents where the children who are forced to perform in support roles, and any time a person under the age of 15 is used in any capacity. The United States takes these allegations of recruitment and use of child soldiers seriously, and we conduct in-depth research through a variety of sources to develop recommendations for the Secretary on which governments should be included in the CSPA list, which is published every year in the annual Trafficking in Persons report. The presidential waiver determinations occur separately from the Secretary's CSPA listing decisions. Once the Secretary has made the determinations for the list, absent a waiver from the President, the CSPA restricts certain forms of security assistance, along with prohibiting the issuance of licenses for the direct commercial sales of military equipment, which go into effect for the upcoming fiscal year. The President decides whether to waive the CSPA restriction on effective security assistance on a case-by-case basis. The President may waive the CSPA restriction if he determines it is both in the national interest of the United States and also, thanks to an amendment to the law, must also certify that the government of the country is taking effective and continuing steps to address the problem of child soldiers. I recognize that there's always room for improvement, but I do wish to note that I believe the Department's efforts over the years have improved, which has both resulted in a higher number of countries being included on the list, but we've also greatly reduced the numbers of waivers or presidential waivers that have been provided. But to be candid, these changes are due in a large part due to the advocacy of members of civil society, especially Joe and Rachel. So I'd like to now kind of talk about how the United States currently uses the CSPA as a prevention tool. So across the globe, we address the scourge of this practice through military and civilian channels and work with concerned citizens, the United Nations, and non-governmental organizations to end this practice. We work to monitor, report, and prevent unlawful recruitment or use of child soldiers, as well as to protect, assist, and support these children by working with civil society and governments where child soldiers are recruited or used. Our approach towards prevention under the CSPA is multifaceted and includes our efforts through diplomatic engagement, support for programs aimed at the demobilization and reintegration of child soldiers, and assistance to strengthen the child protection capabilities of foreign governments. Through these efforts, we aim to not only end the use of child soldiers, but to address the root causes that contribute to this grave violation of children's rights, such as poverty, lack of education, and political instability. The United States encourages governments to improve vetting of recruits, monitor troops to identify, demobilize, and support individuals who have been unlawfully recruited or used as child soldiers, investigate those who are responsible for the unlawful recruitment or use and hold them accountable, and otherwise implement UN action plans. Our prevention efforts also include support through disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration activities. These activities include counseling, formal and informal education, vocational training, and support to former child soldiers. We remain engaged with the United Nations Secretary General's Special Representative for Children Armed Conflict, the UN Security Council, and its Children Armed Conflict Working Group to address the governments that unlawfully recruit or use child soldiers. The impact of the CSPA is significant, but as I noted before, our work is also far from over as the number of conflicts globally continue to grow. We continue to call upon all governments and armed actors to take all necessary steps to prevent and end the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict. We also urge those countries identified in the CSPA to work with us or to work with the United Nations to develop a UN action plan to take concrete, time-bound actions towards compliance and to ensure that children are protected and have the opportunity to continue to contribute positively to their societies in peace. In conclusion, the CSPA stands as a testament to the United States' commitment to the rights and well-being of children worldwide. It is a critical component of our broader efforts to promote security and human rights. As we look forward, let us redouble our efforts, work together with renewed vigor, and ensure that no child is ever again subjected to this abhorrent practice.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Joe. As Joe mentioned, this is something that Stimson or she and I personally have really worked on for the past 25 years, not to date ourselves too much, but it's something that I think is more than just sort of a law and a piece of paper. And so we've really tried, particularly since the law took effect in 2009, to track implementation and to monitor what the law's impact has been. And Dan mentioned some of the amendments that have come out because of that implementation over the years. I don't have time today, because I do want to leave time for questions, to go so much into detail on that monitoring. I will give you some of the highlights, but I want to strongly encourage you to look at a new interactive feature on the Stimson website, that really outlines the origins of the law, the way the law has evolved over time, and its implementation, as well as our annual CSPA implementation tracker that lists all of the countries that have ever been listed under the CSPA, shows what assistance has been provided or waived, and gives really snapshots, country profiles of all of those countries. It's a really fantastic resource. My colleague Ryan Fletcher spends an inordinate amount of time making sure that that is all updated and analyzed every single year, so strongly encourage you to look at that, both of which are on the Stimson website. So I do want to just pick up on a couple of things that Dan and Joe mentioned, particularly with regards to the size of the list of the CSPA. So we saw, Joe mentioned that there were 10 countries that first year. Last year we had a record high of 17. While that does sort of indicate that we've had an expansion of the use of child soldiers worldwide, it also means the United States has become more serious about identifying those countries that have used child soldiers. And I think that's actually an encouraging sign. It sounds negative, but it's actually an encouraging sign so that we can be more rigorous in our utilization of the CSPA. So we're now up to a total of 24 governments that have appeared on the CSPA list at least once since 2010. Most, however, are repeat offenders. 19 of those governments have been listed at least for 2 years or more. 3 of them have appeared on the list every single year since the list was founded, so 14 years, those 3 countries: Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and Yemen. The repeat appearances, I think, illustrate some of the deep-rooted natures of the practices that we're talking about in much of the world, underscore sort of the need for this continued, persistent effort. This isn't just you have a law, you sign an action plan, it's over, but it's really, it requires diplomatic attention for years to come. I also just I think it'd be remiss, I'm also always known as the critical one, I'd be remiss to not point out that while we've seen an expansion of the list, there have always been governments that are repeatedly left off the list despite credible reports, including some from the U.S. government itself, that security forces or government-supported armed groups are using child soldiers. A lot of times, as you can imagine, these are countries that are close security partners to the United States. We've seen some changes in the law, which have allowed the expansion of the list to include some of those, but I think putting politics aside for child protection is really important. I do want to talk about the prohibitions and waivers that Dan mentioned. As he said, governments who are included on the CSPA list are prevented from receiving certain types of U.S. security assistance the following fiscal year, unless they get a military waiver, or sorry, a presidential waiver, or have another kind of exception. Since 2010, at least $215 million worth of arms and assistance to 9 CSPA-listed governments have been withheld due to CSPA provisions. That's not an insignificant amount. When you know the totals of global military assistance, it's actually just a fraction, but it's still an impressive amount. This includes at least $143 million in peacekeeping operations assistance, $70 million in direct commercial sales and military equipment, and $1.4 million in international military education and training, one of which Joe mentioned. This only represents, however, 3% of the total amount of arms sales and military assistance that could have been waived by the CSPA since the law took effect. That means 97% of the assistance that should have been prohibited under the CSPA has been allowed to flow to governments complicit in the recruitment or use of child soldiers. This, again, is because of the use of those waivers that Dan mentioned that are in the national interest of the United States. So 18 of the 24 governments that have ever appeared on a CSPA list have been allowed to receive arms sales and military assistance that otherwise would have been withheld if they not received a waiver. These governments were allowed to receive a staggering $6.3 billion in otherwise prohibited arms and assistance. That's $2.6 billion in foreign military financing, $2.5 billion in peacekeeping operations assistance, $756 million in direct commercial sales of military equipment, $347 million in train and equip assistance under Section 1206 or 333 authorities, $37 million in international military education and financing, and $8 million in the transfer of excess defense articles. I realize that was a lot of numbers and a lot of terms, but I wanted to just give you the idea of the quantity and the value of military assistance that has gone forward. The CSPA is a uniquely powerful child soldier prevention tool. It is not only unique in the United States, but globally and worldwide. We are not seeing other countries implementing such legislation, but I'm asked about it regularly. How did you do this? Where did it come from? How is it effective? From other governments that are interested in ensuring that their military assistance does not support the use of child soldiers. I think Joe's examples demonstrate how it has been used to incentivize positive changes. This law was always intended to be, I think for a U.S. audience understands this saying, it's a carrot, it's not a stick, but it really was intended to leverage the value that governments place on U.S. security assistance and military assistance in order to change behavior that we know is very damaging. Unfortunately, we've seen successive administrations allowing billions of dollars of arms and assistance to flow to governments, complicit in the use of use and recruitment of child soldiers. I think we've been pleased to see not only are the numbers of waivers decreasing, but also the use of partial waivers, so that indicate some aid can go through, but not all, has also been a very powerful tool, and we'd like to see that continue. But I think we'd all sort of come from the perspective that there's still more that can be done to implement this important law. So I want to leave on a positive note. I think there's 3 key steps that we could see not only President Biden take, but also future administrations to implement the CSPA in a more effective way. One is including in the CSPA list that comes out every year all the governments that they consider to be complicit in the recruitment or use of child soldiers, even if that means naming and shaming a partner nation. Second, they should rein in the use of CSP waivers, which would allow us to waive the law's prohibitions only in exceptional circumstances in response to clear and compelling national interests, to sort of allow the CSPA to be used to full its potential. And third, the CSPA, as Joe mentioned, is just one tool in a very large toolbox that U.S. Officials have to change state behavior. So this is part of your diplomatic outreach. It's part of your work with the United Nations and to work in partnership with other child soldier prevention efforts around the world. So I'll conclude by noting that the United States, it's party to the optional protocol on child soldiers, is not only required to prevent the use and recruitment of child soldiers within its own ranks, but also to cooperate with others to prevent violations. And I would love to see sort of the CSPA socialized in a much greater way than we have seen in the past. I'm really grateful for the partnership of Dan and his colleagues at the State Department and for others in the civil society community that have been quite active in this fight for the last 25 years. But this is an attempt to just take stock and not sort of this be the end of the story, but to really move forward. And I think as we mark the 22nd anniversary of the optional protocol's entry into force, it's a good time to, and the last year of this term of the Biden administration, it's a good opportunity to look forward to recommitting to these efforts. I think that still gives us, if I can see, yes, 20 minutes for our Q&A. Perfect. So I want to give our audience here in the room an opportunity to ask a question. If you could raise your hand, Elias will come around with a microphone so that those at home can also hear you. If you are online, you can ask questions by going to www.stimson.org/questions, and you can submit your question online. I can see some questions are already here, but I want to give those in the room, this woman right here in the second row, an opportunity first.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. Tammy Palacios, I run the Priority Sustainable Counterterrorism Program at New Lines. I wonder your thoughts on, obviously you have a certain age, right, 15, 18 when you're talking about CSPA, but when you're talking about prevention, programming, or DDR, in general, what is the intersection when you're just talking about age appropriate, especially thinking of Africa where youth is anywhere 35 or under, right? It's good for me. But, but when you're looking at just programming past CSPA, what are the intersections with other policies and strategies?
So thanks for the question. Yeah, DDR is so important, and I'm glad you raised the issue of age because there is some nuance between, say, 15 and 18. So, you know, one thing that happened sort of concurrent with the adoption of the optional protocol was the adoption of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, which established the recruitment of children under the age of 15 as a war crime. And so, you know, that's powerful to not only be able to say that using children under the age of 18 in hostilities or forcibly recruiting or using them or conscripting them is illegal under international law, but that if you use younger children under 15, that rises to the level of a war crime. I think, you know, there are, you know, differing cultural practices in different countries, and, you know, there are countries where we see, you know, adolescents joining armed groups to defend their communities, or, you know, sort of, and the communities actually accepting the practice. But, you know, the harms that they risk are very real, and I think it points to the need to do more education in terms of what the vulnerabilities of children are. But in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration, you know, it's really critical for children who are recruited and used in armed groups to have the opportunity to re-enter society. And there are a lot of different good groups on the ground that are helping with this. So, you know, UNICEF, humanitarian groups like Save the Children, World Vision, War Child, and others. And it really involves several things. You know, one is, you know, assessing the child's needs. Do they have immediate, you know, medical issues that need to be addressed? Is it possible to reunite them with their families? Are their families in a place where it's safe for the child to go? What are their educational needs? Are they able to reintegrate into school, or would they prefer to enter into a vocational training program? For a lot of these kids, their number one concern is, how am I going to get back into school, or how am I going to support myself? And so, having options is really important, because if they aren't there, the risk is that the child will just join another armed group, because that's what they know how to do. It may be the best source of security or payment for them. Just one additional thing is that we also want to pay attention to individuals who may have been recruited as children but are now over the age of 18. And I think this is a special group that is too often forgotten. And I think we need more assistance to make sure that they also receive reintegration assistance, so that they also have a chance to go back to school or get vocational skills. So thank you for raising that.
I'm going to combine, sorry to our online audience, you may not hear your question exactly, because I'm going to combine three that sort of are on the same theme. And it's for you, Dan, to talk about what do you do, how do you decide who's on that list? Because you have governments that perhaps lie about the age of their recruits. You have children who don't have documentation. Can you talk us through how does the list get made, and how do governments appear as credible violators of not only the optional protocol, but of the use of children in armed conflict?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we developed the list through conducting research from a variety of sources, such as through civil society reporting, intelligence sources, diplomatic reporting, UN reports, and do a thorough assessment to so the law does not require that we have absolute proof. We just need a level of credible information to make the recommendation to the Secretary. And yeah, it's basically an internal review of this information for the credibility assessments, and that's basically the short end. Yeah.
Do you have another question? Yes. Let's go. Actually, let's go here on the front, and then I'll come back.
Thank you. I'm Cyril Roland Deschamps. I'm a human rights advocate from Cameroon. I'm based here at law school, American University, doing fellowship, Hubert Humphrey Fellowship from the U.S. government. And I want to know more, I'm curious to know more about the non-state actor, because protocol laws are for state. Now we have Boko Haram in Nigeria and in northern part in Cameroon. And we also have a separatist crisis in northwest and southwest region, Anglophone region of Cameroon. And those groups are recruiting children in their movement. So I want to try to understand what these laws, or what the U.S. is doing, like preventing this group to recruit children, because the problem is they are recruiting children for for less than $1 or $2 because of sometimes because of money. The second aspect of my intervention is about children who are arrested by armed forces, but we were working with Boko Haram. We have many children in jail in Cameroon. That was children arrested in Boko Haram, in countering Boko Haram. And we have meeting with the Ministry of Justice. It was like they don't know really what to do, because if you have a DDR program for the Northwest and for Anglophone region, to let it be short, there's no like for Boko Haram, because Boko Haram is a terrorist organization. So just curious to know more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Those are great questions. I'm so glad you raised them. So the majority of armed forces or armed groups that are using child soldiers are in fact non-state actors. The optional protocol does say that non-state actors should not, under any circumstances, either recruit or use children under the age of 18. But of course, only governments have the capacity to ratify these instruments. The CSPA is directed to government practice because oftentimes governments don't have much control over the non-state actors that are operating in their territory. And the U.S. generally doesn't fund non-state actors. So the law is a little bit limited in terms of its leverage with NSAs. But on the other hand, the United Nations does have a mandate to engage with both governments and non-state actors. And both Dan and I referenced action plans that have been negotiated by the UN with different parties on the ground. To date, there have been 38 different action plans that have been signed, and the majority of them were actually agreed with non-state actors. So, for example, some of the very first action plans were signed in Côte d'Ivoire, and it was the government and 5 different non-state actors that simultaneously all signed action plans and then implemented them. There's no existing action plan with Boko Haram, so obviously that's a continuing problem. But that is one avenue where non-state actors can get assistance from the UN to take some concrete steps. The question of children who are arrested for their involvement with Boko Haram is a big concern. In 2019, I went to Nigeria and I did research in Maiduguri, which is in the northeast area where Boko Haram is most active. And at that point, the Nigerian government had detained well over 3,000 children because of their association with Boko Haram. And when I interviewed these children who had been detained, many of them actually told me that either they had been abducted or forced into Boko Haram against their will, or they had actually been fleeing Boko Haram when they were apprehended by the government. And they were detained because it was assumed that if they were coming from Boko Haram territory, they must be Boko Haram. And none of them were ever charged. Some of them spent years in prison. And it was really a very terrible situation. I interviewed one boy who was 10 years old, and he said that he had been picked up with his older brother when he was only 5. Nigeria signed a handover protocol, which is another tool that's really useful. It basically committed the government, whenever it took children from Boko Haram into custody, to hand them over to civilian forces or civilian child protection agencies within a short period of time. So rather than put them into military detention, to give them to UNICEF or to Save the Children for rehabilitation. And there's a growing number of governments that have been signing these handover protocols, and that would be a tool for Cameroon to set up a system, with the UN and UNICEF, so that rather than putting these children into detention, they can actually receive rehabilitation assistance. So, that's an avenue.
Yes, please, in the back row here.
Thank you. Hi, Emily Sampson with Save the Children. My question's for Dan. Hi, Dan. How are you? Good to see you. So you spoke a little bit about the definitions under the Child Soldier Prevention Act and looking beyond just combat roles to other types of support. And I would love if you could expand on that a little bit more and talk about efforts to make implementation more gender sensitive, thinking in particular of girls who are forcibly married to militia or paramilitary members, and how difficult it is to verify and track information and data on forms of gender-based violence like that anyway, how you're able to account for that and include that in the way that you're looking at what you're assessing under the Child Soldier Prevention Act. Because even in this conversation, just the fact that we're using child soldier is, limiting and to some extent reductive. And so just wondering the way in which you are able to sort of account for that as we know more since the bill was initially passed. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily. And that was one of the reasons why I did mention how expansive the definition is. But under the law, it gives some illustrative examples, such as children that are used in support roles, such as porters or house cleaners or maids or like sex slaves and so forth. So like, but that's not a definitive, exclusive list. So we look at first primarily when we receive reports of children being used by, armed groups or armed forces at their age to see how it could possibly be qualified under the law. Then we look at the types of roles and the method of their recruitment or how they were being, if they were forcibly recruited into or used by the force, and when we're talking about kind of the gender-specific aspects, we're looking at a good point that you mentioned was like forced marriage of young children. I know that has been a basis for some of the countries in the past. I'm blanking on which one that may have been an exact basis for, but we do look at for all examples of how children are being used, and so we have been trying to incorporate more gender-specific research into our process.
I have a question online about if there's a role that some of the other agencies within the U.S. government can play. So this question specifically mentions AFRICOM, but I could see the question being expanded, if I can, to the person who asked this, to sort of how State Department sort of socializes the CSPA with other agencies or entities within the U.S. government in terms of providing training or data collection. You mentioned that you rely on some of the embassies for credible reports, but are there other ways in which you engage institutions like AFRICOM on the CSPA?
So we do work with the combatant commands and other departments and agencies to educate them about the CSPA. And also, there's internally within their own organizations, they have the doctrine about the recruitment and use and reporting mechanisms that they're supposed to be adhering to. But yeah, that's one of the areas that I think is a possible growth area for us.
I'm going to take one more question from Ari in the back. I recognize that it is 1:57. We may go 1 or 2 minutes over, but we're going to be short and a short answer, and then we'll conclude.
Yeah, so hi everybody. I'm Ari Talani, Director of the Security Assistance Monitor. My question is mostly for Dan. So I know that the Stimson Center particularly has documented, and Rachel talked a little bit about the waiver system and how this has sometimes undermined CSPA implementation. I believe Ryan Fletcher's analysis last year showed about 97% of the material eligible to be restricted was in fact waived. So my question is two-part. First, what sort of rationales does the United States government offer for waiving that security assistance? What is considered a compelling reason to do that? And second of all, is there anything that Congress, civil society, or other actors can do to improve CSPA implementation, particularly in decreasing the amount of material and security assistance, which is ultimately waivered?
Okay, so...
Yeah, short.
Yeah. So to your first question about... I'm sorry.
97%.
Yes.
Compelling reasons.
Yeah, the compelling reasons. So we do make like the justifications for what the president determines for to justify the waivers is a public document and is included now both in the following year's TIP report and is one of the annexes, but it's also a separate section 405. But the law requires us to establish or determine that the government hasn't been making or taking effective and continuing steps. That is a case-by-case basis because of the capabilities of particular governments at any given time, and so like that. Yeah, I think that's as much as we can really talk about that, like beyond what's publicly written or available. I'm sorry.
In terms of what other actors can do to support?
I think continued engagement with the U.S. government or the State Department on this and events like this, and working with Stimson and Human Rights Watch and others if there's changes, that you believe should be made, I do believe that, the advocacy has shown that it's been effective in the past.
And if you have credible reports of child soldier use by government actors, the State Department is very open to receiving those. This is the right time of year, actually, to do those reports as they are preparing that list that comes out usually by the end of June as part of the TIP report. I do recognize that it's exactly 2 o'clock, so I just want to conclude by saying I think we've talked today very comprehensively about the continued challenge that children can face around the world in their continued exploitation and recruitment and use as child soldiers. I hope, though, that you leave not sort of anxious about the plight of children, but really with a greater, which you should, because it still isn't, but that you have some optimism and a greater appreciation for the practical tools that do exist to stop this horrific practice. Not only the CSPA, the action plans, and other bilateral efforts that are possible to, if well implemented, can stop or at least diminish the recruitment and use of child soldiers. I am immensely grateful to Senator Durbin, to Joe, and to Dan for providing their insights today on this topic and their continued partnership and willingness to address this issue. All of you in the audience, it's great to have in-person audiences again here at the Stimson Center, and a special thanks to those joining at home and wherever you are around the world. There were so many questions. I have to say, I was really impressed with the number of questions that we got. We thought an hour event would be sufficient. We could go for about 2 more hours based on the number of questions that we got, which demonstrates to me that this is a topic that is salient and relevant and that there's great interest. So I encourage all of you to reach out to all of us on stage here to discuss these issues further, but also to investigate, as I mentioned, that CSPA implementation tracker, as well as our interactive feature to learn more about this practice. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.